Welcome to the channel. I'm Task Force Bourbon. Today we have a very special blind flight fight in store. As you can tell, we have something centered on Old Taylor, right? And we also have on the table Colonel E.H. Taylor Small Batch, Castle and Key, and Benchmark. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about Old Taylor and Colonel E.H. Taylor, and then as it pertains, the brand E.H. Taylor and its relationship to Benchmark, a budget offering from Buffalo Trace as part of Match Bill number 1, and then Castle and Key, a brand new bourbon out of that Old Taylor distillery. But before we do so and get into the blind flight fight, as promised, we're going to first start talking about E.H. Taylor, the person. Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. is widely considered the, quote, father of the modern bourbon industry, fighting for the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897. As a reminder for those tuning in who might not know, the Bottle and Bond Act, which started on March 3rd this year, would mark 125 years for the passage of the Bottle and Bond Act back in 1897. Back before the days of carefully crafted whiskey and bourbon made by some of the finest palates in the world, consumers couldn't always be sure what was pouring in out of their bourbon bottles. Bottle and Bond is a label for an American-made distilled beverage that has been aged and bottled according to a set of legal regulations contained in the United States government standards of identity for distilled spirits, as originally laid out in the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897. As a reaction to widespread adulteration in American whiskey, the act made for federal government the guarantee of a spirit's authenticity, gave producers a tax incentive for participating, and helped ensure proper accounting and the eventual collection of tax that was due. This combination of advantages led to a group of whiskey distillers led by none other than Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. to join with then Secretary of the Treasury John G. Carlisle to fight for the Bottle and Bond Act. To be labeled as Bottled and Bond or bonded, the liquor must meet a couple of requirements. The first one being that it must be the product of one distillation season. That ranges from either January to June or July to December at one distillery by one distiller. It must be aged in a federally bonded warehouse under U.S. government supervision for at least 4 years. That's a minimum, not a maximum. It must be bottled at exactly 100 proof, labeled with both the identity and location of the distillery, and if different, where it was bottled. And of course, as with all bourbon, but not necessarily true for all bottled and bonds, bottled and bonds must be all made in the United States of America. So, moving on to Edmund Haynes Taylor, now you understand why Bottle and Bond is so relevant for his namesake. He starts back in February 12th, 1830, when he was born, Columbus, Kentucky. Orphaned as a baby, Taylor was adopted by Edmund Haynes Taylor Sr. and was raised in Louisiana by his great uncle Zachary Taylor. Yep, that Zachary Taylor, who became the 12th president of the United States. After attending the Boyers French School in New Orleans, Taylor moved back to Kentucky and matriculated from the B.B. Sayers Academy. In 1851, Taylor returned to Kentucky and moved to Lexington. There, he lived with his immediate uncle by the same name, Edmund Haynes Taylor. The oldest Taylor was a banker by trade, and so Jr. was added to the young Taylor's name to distinguish him from his uncle. Throughout his career, he started and owned 7 different distilleries, the most successful being the OFC distillery, which would later change names to be the George T. Stagg Distillery, and now, as we know it, Buffalo Trace. He did have to sell it to become George T. Stagg due to some bankruptcy and financial issues. In 1869, Taylor purchased a small distillery situated on the banks of the Kentucky River, christened that distillery OFC, Old Fire Copper Distillery, or as you see in the back of this bottle here, it also is known by the name of Old Fashioned Copper Distillery. So really depends on who you ask, because if you ask Buffalo Trace, you actually get 2 different answers sometimes. Taylor began renovating and modernizing their plant. He purchased copper fermentation tanks, new grain grinding equipment, and unique column stills. During his tenure, Taylor also implemented several innovative distilling techniques, including aging whiskey in climate-controlled rickhouses. These techniques are still used by Buffalo Trace and many bourbon distilleries today. After rebuilding his finances, he built a new distillery on Glens Creek near Frankfort, south of it actually. The Old Taylor Distillery, opened in 1887, was designed to resemble a medieval castle with landscaped grounds to look like an estate. Old Taylor Distillery attracted tourists who were given complimentary 10th pints bottles of Old Taylor, much smaller than this, and is considered the, quote, birthplace of bourbon tourism. That's why I'm wearing this shirt now. So the Kentucky Bourbon Trail might not be here if it weren't for Kentucky Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. So we were going to move forward here into OTD's history a little bit. OTD, Old Taylor Distillery, remained in local control after Taylor died in 1922 until National Distillers acquired the operation in 1935, who operated it until 1972. All right, a lot of years there. But we're going to move on to 1987 when Jim Beam steps in, purchasing it from National Distillers, who uses the warehouse to store and age bourbon. Around 1994 timeframe, they look at this as a basically waste of space and look to start maybe selling it, but that doesn't happen until 2009 when they sell the brand to Sazerac in a deal where they get Effin' Vodka in a deal from Sazerac. Since 2011, Buffalo Trace produces under, of course, their parent company Sazerac, EHT, that's of course Edmund Haynes Taylor bourbon branded products. Well, not all bourbons. The historic Old Taylor Distillery was purchased, renovated, and in 2016 began distilling products and spirits under the Castle and Key brand, although Castle and Key shares no affiliation with Buffalo Trace or the EHT brand. More of that later. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these bourbons. That's a little bit about the man himself. But first up, because this is what we're here for. We're here to identify, if this $20 gigantic bottle can stand up to Bottle and Bond E.H. Taylor small batch, a premium option. This is, of course, a entry-level product, right, in the E.H. Taylor branded products lineup. But can it stand up against that? Can it stand up against what is being produced at the Old Taylor Distillery? Can it stand up to maybe its competitor? All right. But Old Taylor, the bourbon, is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey produced, of course, like we talked about, at Buffalo Trace Distillery. This other brand, E.H. Taylor, is produced in, as we see here, small batch, single barrel, barrel proof. They got a rye. They got a whole bunch of limited edition expressions. The list goes on. We're not going to get into those. Most of them, however, are all bottled in bond, while Old Taylor is not, right? So small batch is, like I said, the introductory to the E.H. Taylor whiskey lineup. It's a blend of what is presumed to be 7-year-old barrels hallowed from the 6th floor of a brick warehouse in Kentucky. Bottled in bond, of course, makes it 100 proof, and is packaged in a vintage canister reminiscent of the bottles Taylor used over 100 years ago. It comes in a canister, too, which is pretty well known for. And it's got this orange tack strip here, which is kind of neat. They used to be green, so I actually don't know the story why this one is orange, but the tack strips traditionally used for bottled and bond products were in fact green. This, like all three of these products, so you got Benchmark, Old Taylor, and Colonel E.H. Taylor Small Batch, are all from Buffalo Trace's mash bill number 1. That's a low rye mash bill, officially undisclosed, so we don't actually know, but we all but presume it to be about 10% or less rye as the secondary flavoring grain behind corn, right? Was compared to mash bill number 2 being their high rye mash bill at estimated 12 to 15% rye. However, in the bourbon community, that's not exactly a high rye bourbon when you look at things like Four Roses in the 30+% range. Now, all of E.H. Taylor products are generally, right, I'm going to say that here so nobody beats me up about it, generally aged in Warehouse C. So you'll see one of those limited edition offerings, for example, being called Colonel E.H. Taylor Warehouse C. That's obviously exclusively from Warehouse C, but all of these are aged in his old brick warehouses that are centuries old, and it even says so much on the back of their bottle. Now, that Warehouse C specifically was built over Taylor's oversight in 1881 and is regarded now as an exceptional aging warehouse. But again, most of this product does come from that exact warehouse. However, that's not exactly, it doesn't have to be true. They can pull from a couple other different places. And small batch means whatever it means to this product. They go so far as on the back of this together, it says a small batch of these select barrels were then blended together to deliver a distinctive character that is like no other, et cetera, so forth, right? So whatever that is, it means to get the flavor profile that's consistent with this brand and label. Now we're going to move into the benchmark lineup we have here. You can see that both of these are, in fact, a budget offering. This is what we call an indicator. They're in plastic containers bigger than my head, okay, and sold at less than 20 bucks at this size. So they are, in fact, budget offerings, right? And that's really agnostic to your own personal means, right? I mean, if not, I'm sorry, but because really, if you talk about, a $100 bottle, that's relative, right? But, when you talk about a $20 bottle this size, this is, in fact, a budget offering. The Benchmark brand was created by Seagram's back in the late 1960s to be a luxury or premium level bourbon. At that time, whiskey was not called McAfee's like it is today. You'll see it really small print here, right above the name Benchmark. Originally, Benchmark was sold in a decanter-style bottle with a black label. The Benchmark brand was purchased by the Sazerac Company in 1989 from Seagram's. It's still owned by Sazerac Brands of New Orleans, which, of course, we know is owned by, which owns and operates Buffalo Trace Distillery. The origin of McAfee name is that Hancock McAfee was in 1775 one of the first European settlers at the site where Buffalo Trace stands today. The original Benchmark was made at Lawrenceburg, Kentucky at the Four Roses Distillery when Seagram's owned it. According to Buffalo Trace, quote, in 1773, three McAfee brothers named James, George, and Robert left Virginia westward to explore the uncharted territory that would later become known as Kentucky, traveling by canoe at first. The McAfee Company eventually followed a native trail overland that led to the Great Buffalo Crossing, where the brothers surveyed the land now home to the world's most award-winning distillery, Buffalo Trace Distillery. The surveyor marks left behind are known as benchmarks, and the bourbon whiskey honors the pioneering spirits of these early American explorers, end quote. When asked about this expansion, in fact, I actually reached out to Amy Presk, which handles media relations at Buffalo Trace, about why in steps Benchmark bonded, in steps Benchmark single barrel. Yeah, I know you can't see it, it's a little off screen here, so I'm going to raise it for a sec. You got the small batch Benchmark, you got the top floor Benchmark, which guess what? This pulled from top floors, and then Benchmark foolproof. That was not all the way on. Goodness, could have been a disaster. Asked about this expansion, she just had a very simple quote to provide back to me that said, Benchmark has been gaining in popularity over the past decade, and consumers have been asking for additional expressions in the lineup. That's it. So thanks to you all, I guess, and me, that's why we have these Benchmark expressions. And we'll probably do a tasting of these in the future, but spoiler alert, foolproof's my favorite. Now, moving into Castle and Key, or moving backwards maybe, because as we already talked about, Old Taylor Distillery is now where Castle and Key is producing their products. In 2014, Castle and Key co-founders Will Arvin and Wes Murray purchased the defunct derelict site. After buying the site and beginning its restoration into the modern distillery, Castle and Key has done numerous contract distilling runs and released their own gin and rye, but no bourbon. Arvin said, quote, it was actually for sale on the MLS. That's a retail website, or realtor website. I came out, saw it, and absolutely fell in love with this place. It had been abandoned since 1972, so it was in terrible state of affairs. So, from 2013 to now, this place has been transformed back to what I would hope to make Colonel Taylor proud from his days in the 1800s when it was show place in Kentucky. Today, which was 26 March 22, is historic because we are selling our first bourbon under the Kentucky or Castle and Key label. In 2015, the company announced that Marion Barnes would become their master distiller. Barnes, a former master taster at Brown-Forman and an assistant at Old Forester, was the first female master distiller since Prohibition. However, Castle and Key representatives said, quote, after joining the Castle and Key team, Marion helped to develop Castle and Key's recipes, processes, and oversaw distillation until 2019. She departed Castle and Key before our whiskey is at its point of maturity. Castle and Key's new bourbon reflects the blending skills of John Brown, Castle and Key's quality manager, who runs the research and development department, and Brett Connors, who handles blending at the distillery on a day-to-day basis. Castle and Key's bourbon's mash bill is 73% white corn, 10% rye, and an unusually high 17% malted barley. This first release was created as two separate mash batches at 80 barrels each. Both are blends of barrels aged 4 years. And the owners claim that no Castle and Key small batch will ever taste exactly the same. So batch one will be batch unique of itself. Now, last but not least, we can't really go into this without talking about the Bourbon War. You heard me right, the Bourbon War between Buffalo Trace and Castle and Key. So the use of the trademark Old Taylor Distillery, the namesake of E.H. Taylor, as we know, was contested before a Sixth Circuit panel in a dispute dubbed by one of the judges as the start of the Bourbon War. Sazerac Brands LLC, which owns trademarks for Old Taylor and Colonel E.H. Taylor, says Peristyle LLC, after it purchased the abandoned Old Taylor Distillery in 2014 and renovated the property to begin bourbon production. Peristyle eventually renamed the property Castle and Key in 2016, but Sazerac claims Peristyle used the Old Taylor name up to the point to cash in on the goodwill and notoriety associated with the name. U.S. District Judge Gregory Van Tatenhove in Kentucky sided with Peristyle and granted its motion for summary judgment on Sazerac's trademark infringement claims last year. That would have been, I think, 2017 perhaps. Quote, in this case, Judge Van Tatenhove wrote, both Sazerac and Peristyle want to share in Colonel Taylor's striking story, and the law allows both parties to do so. Sazerac's trademark rights in the Old Taylor and Colonel E.H. Taylor names provide the party with certain legal protections, and now Peristyle's restoration of one of Colonel Taylor's former properties provides a new distillery, too, with some historically based advantages. Buffalo Trace's attorney had cited a survey about Peristyle's use of the property and said that 44% of consumers are, quote, confused by the name located at the site of the distillery. Whereas Castle and Key's attorney had gone on to say all Castle and Key has ever done is to refer to E.H. Taylor and the Old Taylor Distillery descriptively and geographically. So there you have it. Contentious to say the least, but here we are. There is a Castle and Key bourbon produced at the Old Taylor Distillery. That's not to say it is using any of Old Taylor's recipes or mash bills or any of his techniques, but it's being made there. So yeah, I think it deserves to be in this lineup. And without further ado, I'm going to slide these a little bit more center-like. We're going to go ahead and try to find out, not necessarily tasting notes, but rather which one is better. And we're going to rack and stack them against one another in sort of a race car flight. I'm going to keep sliding these forward. I probably should start back here. And I'm just going to go left to right because that makes the most sense to me. They all kind of look the same. Colonel E.H. Taylor, I don't know why I looked at it. Obviously comes in 100 proof. Old Taylor comes in at 80 proof. Castle and Key comes in at 98 proof. And Benchmark comes in at, again, an 80 proof. So you get 80, 80, 98, and 100. So while I wouldn't necessarily recommend a 20-point jump for a blind flight fight because you can kind of tell, right, if you have anywhere near a seasoned palate. But it still can be done. And since there's two at 80 and two basically at 100, 198, I think we might be fine. So let's go ahead and dig in. Sorry about the digression. Last one smells like bourbon. Nothing really unique on it. That is very light-bodied. And it's really hard to tell how balanced a light-bodied bourbon is. This is probably one of the Old Taylor or Benchmark, if I had to guess, due to how light-bodied it is, and the basically just guessing off the maybe supposed proof. But so it's really hard to tell the balance, of that because it's not heightened enough and it's so subdued that everything seems like it might be balanced, but in fact it might not be. I'm just going to jump into glass two. I guess that sits where it sits. This one's got a fantastic nose on it. Floral, some grains. It doesn't necessarily look different. Like if I'm assuming this is, one of the 80 proofers, it doesn't look too terribly different in color, but it smells different. Yet as equally light-bodied almost, but this one has a little bit more depth to it. I'm going to slide glass two a smidgen forward. Yeah, none of your sweeter notes, none of the caramels or things like that. Maybe a bit more grainy, but it's got a little more depth to it. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Oh, glass three is really rich. Got a little bit of a spice kick going on at the end. Some floral notes. That one's going above. That's my favorite thus far. And then glass 4. Oh, this one's got some like nice older oaks notes on it, just a little bit. I mean, I'm drinking what could be, 2-year bourbons to 3-year bourbons, and then I'm jumping to what could be like 6 to 8-year bourbons. So if this is what I think it is, that makes sense. I'm easily going glass 4 number 1. So I could sit here all day and forth, but I feel very confident about where I feel in the lineup. So I'm going to start. This is it. This is where it is. I don't even need another flight. I know this is where they rack and stack. Easy day. Glass 1 is Old Taylor. So maybe not worth the hype, if there is any. Glass number 2 is Benchmark. So I like Benchmark over Old Taylor. That might make a little sense because, while mash bill number 1 this is presumed to come from mash bill number 1, it's not in fact known. So I don't think I even read that. I might have even in fact skipped over it. Yeah, I most certainly did. So while Buffalo Trace publishes information about both these products, Benchmark and its E.H. Taylor lineup, there's nothing on its website about Old Taylor. And so what does that mean? It means we know that this is a 3-year age state. It says no less than 36 months somewhere on here, or it used to. It probably says it. Anyways, trust me, this is a 3-year bourbon. And so we don't know. In fact, there is rumor out there that this comes from that old Jim Beam distillate that was purchased back when it was acquired by Jim Beam. So I don't know. Did I even in fact talk about that? Yeah, I think I might have skipped over that. This used to have a 6 on it, a 6-year age statement. But all that was left for a while. There's no 6 on here anymore. Was a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, which means that we know it's at least 2 years. But it's definitely likely younger than 6 years. And because of the price, it means that it competes with Benchmark as it's Buffalo Trace's budget mash bill number 1. But again, undisclosed from exactly where this is from. We only speculate that it's from mash bill 1 based on the relationship that it potentially has with E.H. Taylor. However, again, rumor out there is that this may be in fact from that 2009 purchase from Sazerac, from Jim Beam, and this could be old Jim Beam distillate. So, rumor, right? But whatever that's worth. And then glass number 3, Castle and Key. That rhymed, and I swear that wasn't intentional. Which leads to no surprise, E.H. Taylor small batch. So I feel very confident about this. I mean, these two were really kind of fun to see where they fell in the Old Taylor and Benchmark against one another as the budget offerings from Buffalo Trace on the potentially mash bill number 1 side of the house. But it is fun to see where these brackets stack, the E.H. Taylor and the Castle and Key. I do like Castle and Key. I'm very surprised for what is a 4-year age stated bourbon. Generally sometimes bourbons get a lot of hype behind it, and you're like, maybe not so much. But this is pretty decent for what you should be able to pick it up for. But if given the choice, looks like I'm picking E.H. Taylor small batch every time. But until then, cheers. I can't stop the video.